Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. Today I'm your moderator, Karl Cassell, CEO and President of Horizons, a Family Service Alliance. Today we'll be discussing zero-tolerance policies in the schools and the effect that they have on the students and the community in general. It is important that all of our students are successful and that violence, weapons, drug use, and abuse in the schools doesn't occur, and how we handle these disruptions is a focus of our discussion today. To my immediate left, we have three panelists who will be discussing this topic with us today. First, Sergeant Christy Hamblin from the Cedar Rapids Police Department. Good morning.
Good morning.
To her immediate left, Becky Belcher, Assistant Lynn County Attorney, Juvenile Division. Good morning.
Good morning.
And finally, Dick Socwell, a psychologist. Thank you for joining us this morning.
You're welcome.
Zero tolerance initially was defined as consistently enforced suspension and expulsion policies in response to weapons, drugs, and violent acts in the school. Over time, however, zero tolerance has come to refer to school or district-wide policies that mandate predetermined, typically harsh consequences or punishments, such as suspension and expulsion, for a wide degree of rule violations. And so, with that being said, the first question for our panelists is simply, has this policy worked as well as suspected when it was first instituted? And any of you can start if you want.
Well, I think I'll start it off. Originally, I mean, because it first went into effect years and years ago, and I don't think that we took into account, or the schools didn't, and I can't speak for the schools because I'm not part of them, but it started off a little bit different than what it is today. Today's society, we have 3 school resource officers, or SROs is what we call them. We have one currently at Kennedy, at Jefferson, and at Washington, and we have found it to be so successful that we're now expanding it to college community, to the high school, and then also to Polk, which is one of our newer schools. And really what we do now is, I was talking to the SROs, and one of the things that they talked about is we still have zero policy or zero tolerance when it comes to weapons, when it comes to drugs, and pretty much when it comes to fighting. However, there is some play or wiggle room with that. And when it comes to weapons, now we've got to have zero tolerance to a certain extent with our SROs. And then we're talking in the high school level versus grade school or middle school.
Okay, good. Either one of you?
I guess it's hard for me to speak to how well it's working. I'm aware of the zero tolerance policy and the general category of offenses that are concerned with that. But we generally don't see young people coming into our system until they've had several encounters and several violations, several offenses, such as maybe disorderly conducts, assaults in the school, fighting, and generally they have to have had several of those referrals before we would even be looking at getting them involved in the court system. And as far, I know that a few years ago we met with the school district and came up with some modifications, I thought, of the zero tolerance policy on specific offenses such as disorderly conduct, trespass, and interference with official acts. And the agreement there was that the schools could have some leeway to deal with those offenses without necessarily always contacting the police department and having law enforcement officers come out.
Correct. That's what we've continued doing. The law enforcement officer, the SRO, is already there, and so there's alternative ways that some of those things could be handled. Okay. So we're trying so the zero tolerance policy is there to a certain extent, but it's not 100% about everything.
Okay.
You know, there are variations, I think, nationwide in terms of how zero tolerance policies are written. And of course, there's tremendous variation just from school to school in terms of how they're implemented, because now we're talking about personalities and people and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, I looked up a little bit of the research on it before today, and a lot of the research indicates that the zero tolerance policies, generally speaking, really haven't done much to reduce the difficulties. Now, I'm sure there is variability. I'm sure there are specific situations where things have gone well. There are also other research that point to alternative approaches being more effective, and I'm sure that varies greatly. You know, it's hard to make a general statement, I think, about whether zero tolerance works or doesn't work. I think it's necessary on the drugs and alcohol and violence and guns that we don't tolerate that. Exactly what not tolerating means, I guess, is another thing. But in any case, I think the research is kind of mixed as to whether it really works or doesn't work.
Well, and so that leads into my next question, as you talk about some of the alternatives. And so as we look at the increase or the decrease in some of those instances, I know one study that I saw today talked about the reductions. Some of the alternatives lead to about 20 to 60% reduction in the referrals in the schools and some of those things. And so would we say, or could we say, or would we agree or disagree that it does increase or decrease one way or the other having zero tolerance in the schools? I know you spoke to it a little bit, but if you want to expand, and then you guys have an opportunity to weigh in.
My personal feeling on this is that a combination of alternative approaches and zero tolerance policy would be good. That is, zero tolerance. You know, you bring a gun to school, you're suspended, right. End of story. But with regard to some of the other, you might call them maybe more minor things, I think as you spoke, Christy, to having the officer right there who is in the situation, who can find out what happened and use a little bit of discretion about whether this is a situation where a child needs to be expelled or suspended, or whether we need to take some other kinds of actions. And the other types of actions that are available are just numerous kinds of things.
A lot of the cases that I see involve children who a lot of them are in counseling or are dealing with medication issues, and they literally, they cannot tolerate much structure, what they get at the school, and some of them are just become out of control. And they start screaming and shouting, turning over furniture, kicking, biting. I guess I don't know how you would use those alternative methods with somebody who is totally out of control.
Well, I think once they're out of control, there are only a small number of things you can do, but there's certainly a lot of other sorts of things. If we're aware that this is a child who has difficulty in his home, an unstable home, has some mental health issues and so forth, I certainly think that's an opportunity for people to devise some sort of an approach to this child that would be more helpful. This is a child who erupts when you confront him. Well, let's not confront him. Let's find another way to deal with him. Education shouldn't be cookie cutter, one for everybody. You know, we really ought to individualize. And boy, that's a hard thing to do, but it is a doable thing.
And because I'm seeing the same kids. I mean, once a week, every 2 weeks, it's just the same behaviors and nothing. Obviously, an alternative way has to be found, because what we're doing now isn't working with that particular young person, and eventually they're going to end up in the court system. Right. And there's a limited amount that we can do with a child like that, because really they don't merit, usually residential treatment unless there's some severe mental health issues involved, and not at such a young age.
Correct. Yeah, and one of the things that I know our officers have tried with the schools, and we work closely with Cedar Rapids schools, our juvenile courts as well, disorderly conducts. That was one of the things we were seeing, a real high increase of disorderly conducts in the schools. And so we determined as a collective group to try to reduce that and the disparity in the arrests is something that the community is working on really big right now. And we found, we did a great job of reducing the number of disorderly conducts. We're able to work with school officials and reduce that number. And unfortunately, we thought we were doing really good, but unfortunately our disparity didn't change. It made it even worse. And so we're still looking at other ways that we can reduce that disparity, bring it into the right balance, but working on reducing those calls as well.
And we'll deal with some of that here in just a minute, but I want to go back to something that Becky said, having basically repeat offenders. So does zero tolerance eliminate future behavior, or do you see the kids that consistently are having these issues getting in trouble over and over again? Or is it those kids spark other kids to do the same things, but wouldn't it still increase a little bit future happenings? It's not a deterrent, obviously.
The young people I'm talking about, I'm not seeing zero tolerance working.
Okay.
Because they're coming back again and again and again. And first they're handled without going to the juvenile court services, then eventually it keeps on happening and they get referred to juvenile court. Juvenile court works with them informally, and when they still keep often picking up or having the disorderly conduct at schools, and eventually it comes to our office where we have to start filing. And it's not that we want to, it's just, it's kind of like everybody's kind of throwing up their hands saying, please get involved because there's nothing more we can do.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're seeing is that some of the kids that are in the repeat offender category, or that we're seeing at a more violent level, is at the lower ages. And that's the scary thing, is that some of that violent behavior is getting down into our grade schools as well. And so again, we're working with the school officials closely, trying to reduce that number and to get them the appropriate care as well, because that's where we need more people like you that we can provide that service to some of the younger kids.
I'm seeing the same thing, younger and younger kids.
Well, it is younger and younger. You know, I want to go back to this throwing up my hands because I'm out of options idea. You know, I see people every day in my office, and one of the things I try to point out to them, the adults, is that, you know, from my perspective, because I have a limited knowledge as an individual, I may only see 2 or 3 options for dealing with an issue. One of the advantages of going to see someone else, you get another viewpoint. There may be 5 or 6 possibilities. And so we get the school system, the people in the school system throwing up their hands because they're limited. They only have a few things they can do. You know, I think back to a number of years ago, I had a young man who had Asperger's disorder, and as a result of that, you know, they don't understand social cues and all that sort of thing. He would constantly do inappropriate things, touching people and so forth that he shouldn't do. The school system, school officials were totally basically done with him. And I went to a meeting and I tried to help them understand what Asperger's disorder is and how we can help these kids to learn the skills that they need. And I got one of the teachers to be a mentor for him, who met with him every morning when he got there, talked about the goals, met with him before he left at night, spent some time with him. You know, the child was quite successful that year. There are options. Now, there are also children, realistically, that we're just not going to reach. I mean, we have to, but I think we need to identify them first by trying a bunch of options and then say, well, this child isn't going to be reachable.
I would like to throw something else out there too. The school is using suspensions as a punishment or as a way of dealing with this issue. A lot of the kids that I work with don't see a suspension as a punishment. I mean, they're more than happy to leave school and go home or go do whatever they want to do. I don't see that as a good tool.
Right.
In addition to everything else, I don't see it working.
And have they proposed any alternatives? Are we hearing about any alternatives to suspension being thrown out there? Because if you're throwing kids out of school who don't want to be in, as you said, they're celebrating that or looking for ways to continue to get in trouble.
And I think one of the things, again, talking to our school resource officers, that is kind of a last alternative, is the suspension part. We're trying, and and right now we don't have the in-school suspension because I know a young lady that she's been suspended for swearing at the teacher, and she looks forward to that, because she doesn't have to go to school, she doesn't have to deal with it, and so and that's not in Cedar Rapids School District. But one of the things we're looking at is alternative to suspensions. So they're trying. I know our school resource officers are really working hard with their principals and their staff to find other alternatives to that suspension. Because if they're not in school, they're going to be out in the community, and that's where we want them to be, in the school as much as possible,
Right.
so that we can keep an eye on them and keep them progressing towards that graduation, because that's the key.
That's the goal. You brought up Asperger's, child with Asperger's, and so my question would be, do kids with special needs even suffer more under these zero tolerance policies because people don't know how to interact with them when they maybe start showing out or doing things that are abnormal? The first thing is, let's get them out of here as far away as we possibly can. Do they suffer the ill effects of
I
this
think
policy?
definitely. In fact, 2 young men that I've had recently, and they're young, like 12, 13, which we normally would be filing, simple misdemeanors on, kids that age. But they've actually come in court and told the judge, I can't tolerate I can't deal with the way they're talking to me in school. I can't stand people touching me. When they invade my personal space, I can't tolerate that. And they're usually the 2 I know that I've seen recently, they are in counseling, and they do have defined issues that they're trying to deal with. They're taking some medication to try to deal with that behavior. And they just have a lower tolerance, I think, for what other children may be able to deal with easier. And they have an overreaction to that.
I know one of the issues that our department deals with, and I would go along with you, that if they are receiving counseling, that a lot of times, obviously with HIPAA and privacy issues, that no, we're not ever going to know, and schools won't either. But I think you hit it right on the head, that a lot of it is that education. 20 years ago, law enforcement, we didn't know what Asperger's was, let alone pronouncing it. But yet now it's the education piece, and that's the same thing. I'm guessing, not speaking for the schools, but I'm guessing it's a learning curve for them as well. That no, if there's issues, if we can be educated about it, our department be educated about Asperger's and those needs. And with state laws changing, we've got to have mental health. We have to have 4 hours of mental health every 4 years. Things like that will help tremendously, and I would assume in the schools they're learning, about those things just as well, if not.
They are learning more. There is a learning curve, you're right, and usually we're behind the curve a bit. But education is terribly important, and we're talking about education, but now we switch to educating people, like educating educators about these issues, educating parents about how do you manage children's behavior better. This is something that just isn't done, although I deal with it every day in my office, but it's a small portion of the society. But helping parents to learn how to deal with the children better, having people go into the homes, there's some of that going on. Working with the children starting from a young age, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and educating them about how do you resolve conflicts. What are good problem-solving techniques? How can you work together rather than having to be aggressive? There's a lot of stuff that can be done.
And
it's slow, I'm sure, but it's...
And one of the things that our department, again, is seeing is that the lack of the parent participation. And if we could hold the parents not accountable for their children's actions, but hold them accountable for being a part of that solution, part of that education. Is vital as well. And I think that's, as we've talked on a lot of other issues, Karl, that's a missing key, is that the parental involvement.
I would agree.
We have about 7 minutes left, and so I really want to deal with a topic here that might be a little uncomfortable, but we know the data, the numbers don't lie. And so I think we have to deal with the disproportionality in terms of race and how these consequences play themselves out. And so I would love for you guys to speak to a little bit what we see being the reason for, if you can ascertain to what some of the reason is, the disproportionality amongst the races. Same behavior, but different results in terms of the discipline. Floor is open.
There's always a risk for a racial element. I mean, that's just human nature. Now, not everyone is a racist, but, and many people who are would say they're not. But in terms of actions, do we treat people of different race differently? Yeah. I don't think there's any question about that. It may not be to the degree that it's going to be terribly, terribly disproportional. But I think whenever we have human beings involved, we have that as a risk factor. And I don't know how to describe it exactly. I don't have a solution, but I know that that's human nature, and I know that that happens. And are more people of the racial minorities likely to be given suspensions and expulsions? Yep. Yes. And what's the explanation for that? I think it's complex. Yeah.
And I would agree. One of the things, again, that we're looking at is how can we, and it goes back kind of to the parental involvement, how can we get the parents involved? You know, I know with children in foster care or being removed from the home, that's one of the things that the state found out was kids of color are being removed more often and are staying in detention longer, are in foster care longer than their white counterparts because of that family dynamics. With kids of color, they don't have that family tree that they can lean on that non-African American kids do. So I think, again, going back to the point I made earlier, I think we need to get more family or community involvement. It's not the police department's fault, it's not the school's fault, it's not the county attorney's office fault, it's not juvenile courts, it's not DHS detention, but it's a community issue. It's not something that the police is going to fix all by ourselves or the schools by themselves. It's got to get the whole community involved.
I think both Christy and Dick pretty much raised the same things that I would have said. I don't have statistics, so I can't really tell you the proportion of minority kids that come through our system from the schools for these sorts of issues compared to the population as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the last things I want to deal with is just the effect that kids being out of school for a long period of time have on their educational attainment, their future goals, eventually maybe college or even employment afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about the ill effects of suspensions, expulsions, and kids being out of school, and how that has a lasting effect on their future.
For me, what I see is that the more suspensions, it kind of just has a snowball effect. They and their friends will get together when they're out of school, they'll get into trouble. Pretty soon they're not even bothering going back to school, they're just going to be not attending. And of course that obviously has a major impact because they're not going to get their education. And chances are, while they're not attending school, they're going to get into more and more serious legal difficulties, which may end up with them being actually placed somewhere in a residential program because of more serious violations. So, yeah, I mean, unless there's some intervention that is more successful than what we have or more impactful, it has a great effect.
Well, from law enforcement standpoint, we'd love to have year-round school because
It's a great idea.
yeah, I don't have kids in school anymore, so and it wouldn't be a hardship. But I know for parents, sometimes it is a hardship if they're on different schedules. But one of the things that I know, again, our department, we see an increase during summer breaks, during Christmas break, during spring break. We have more criminal mischiefs, more thefts, shoplifting, those things. And with the suspension as well. And sometimes we'll have the kids get in trouble as a collective group so that they can all,
go together.
Right. And so I think that one of the things we need to be looking at is looking at the in-school suspensions, looking at ways that we, that we're continue down the path that we're going with our SROs and finding alternatives to not having them in school. Having officers go out and collect the kids if they're not showing up at school. I know currently we're doing that as well. We're going out with the counselors and making sure that little Johnny or little Susie is in school, and if not, again, holding parents accountable, especially for the grade school kids.
No reason
Get
we
up
shouldn't.
and get to
them
school, and mom and dad, you get them to school as well.
Absolutely. Dick, anything?
The more you miss school, the more information you're going to miss. The more information you miss, the more poorly you're going to do. The more poorly you're going to do, the less likely you're going to feel like, yeah, you know what, this is a place I can be successful. And the more you feel that lack of motivation, less commitment you make, the more likely you're going to do stuff you ought not to do in that setting. I just think that that's a very clear cycle.
I think one of the things that in some of the studies that we've found is that we have to start believing in our kids as well.
Absolutely.
And finding alternatives. Not everybody, how I'm going to learn 1 + 1 is 2 is different than Becky and Dick, and we're going to find some alternative ways to teaching our kids and then encouraging them. We got to have one person believe in a kid for them to be successful.
Absolutely. Well, and I think you guys raise good points, and we have to consider the long-term and the future effects of those children who, for the most part, stay in our community. And there's stats out there that say about 80% of the kids that graduate high school in Cedar Rapids stay in Cedar Rapids. And so if that be the case, then we need to figure out a way that we can help them achieve their educational goals, but also secure the safety of the kids that are going to our schools, so those circumstances don't perpetuate themselves as well. Well, we're out of time this morning. We certainly appreciate our guests joining us and adding their insight and their perspective on this topic. We certainly didn't exhaust it, but we do know it needs to continue to be discussed in the public square as well as in our school settings, so as we mentioned, kids can succeed. I hope you will continue tuning in every week to Ethical Perspectives on the News. Again, I'm Karl Cassell, your moderator. I thank you for joining us this morning and hope to see you again soon. Thank you and good morning.